My name is Ava Carter, and if someone had told me 2 years ago that one stupid joke would completely change my life, I probably would have laughed too. At that time, I still believed marriage meant loyalty, family meant safety, and love meant people would notice when you were hurting. I learned later that some people only notice you when you stop giving them everything. It happened during the annual summer barbecue at my husband Ethan's family house in America. The place looked like something from a magazine. A giant white house with tall windows, a sparkling swimming pool, and expensive garden lights that glowed softly when the sun went down. Ethan loved that house because it made his family look successful. His father, Robert Carter, talked about money every chance he got, and his mother, Linda, treated every barbecue like it was a royal event. Nothing could ever look imperfect around them, especially not me. By evening the backyard was crowded with relatives, neighbors, and Ethan's friends from work. Music played from hidden speakers near the pool while the smell of grilled burgers and steak filled the warm air. Everyone carried drinks and laughed loudly like they didn't have a single problem in the world. I stood near the grill holding a paper plate with a hot dog on it, smiling whenever someone looked at me because that was easier than admitting how exhausted I felt inside. The truth was that I had spent years trying to fit into Ethan's family. No matter how hard I tried, it never felt enough. Linda criticized my clothes in sweet little comments disguised as advice. Robert barely remembered my birthday every year. Ethan always promised things would get better, but he never defended me when his family crossed the line. And Chloe, Ethan's younger sister, enjoyed making me feel small more than anyone else. Chloe sat on one of the patio chairs wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun had almost disappeared. She had a drink in one hand and her phone in the other. Everyone around her paid attention whenever she spoke because she loved being the center of every conversation. Then she looked directly at me and laughed. "You know what's funny?" she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If Ava disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice." For half a second, everything became quiet in my head. Then everyone burst out laughing. Robert laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Linda shook her head like Chloe had said something clever. Even Ethan laughed. Maybe not as loudly as the others, but enough for me to hear it clearly. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly and completely. I remember staring down at the hot dog in my hand while the laughter continued around me. My chest felt tight, but strangely calm at the same time. Almost like my heart had stopped fighting reality and simply accepted it. So I slowly raised my hot dog like a champagne glass and smiled. "Challenge accepted," I said. More laughter followed because they thought I was joking too. But I wasn't. That night, after everyone left and Ethan fell asleep upstairs, I packed one suitcase in silence. I took my passport, my savings, and the little bit of dignity I still had left. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, I walked out of that beautiful house without leaving a single note behind. And this time, I made sure nobody would ever find me again. The road out of the city felt endless that night. I drove with the windows slightly open, letting the cold air hit my face while the radio played quietly in the background. Every few minutes I checked my phone, half expecting Ethan to call or send a message asking where I was. But the screen stayed dark the entire drive. By sunrise, I realized something painful. Nobody had even noticed I was gone yet. That hurt more than Chloe's joke. I stopped at a small gas station outside the city and bought coffee for $3 and a cheap sandwich I could barely eat. My hands shook while I counted my money. I had $18,400 hidden in a private account Ethan knew nothing about. I had been saving little amounts for years without fully understanding why. Maybe some part of me already knew I would eventually need a way out. For the first time in years, I was completely alone. And honestly, it terrified me. 3 days later, I arrived in Europe carrying one suitcase, 2 jackets, and a heart that still felt bruised. I chose a quiet coastal town called Brighton Cove because nobody there knew my name. The town was small but beautiful, filled with narrow streets, flower boxes hanging from windows, and tiny cafes where people actually smiled at strangers. It felt nothing like the loud, polished world Ethan's family loved so much. I rented a little stone cottage at the end of Willow Lane. The owner, an older man named Thomas Bennett, charged me £900 a month and apologized 3 times for the house being too simple. I almost laughed when I stepped inside because to me it felt perfect. The cottage had creaky wooden floors, soft yellow walls, and a tiny kitchen with windows facing the ocean. There was even a small garden filled with wild lavender growing beside the porch. That first night, I sat alone on the floor eating bread and cheese from a paper bag because I didn't own plates yet. The silence around me felt strange. Back in America, Ethan always kept the television running, even when nobody watched it. His family hated quiet moments because silence forced people to think. But there in that little cottage, silence felt peaceful. Still, peace didn't come immediately. The first few weeks were hard. I woke up every morning expecting to hear Ethan's voice or Linda criticizing something in the kitchen. Sometimes I reached for my phone before remembering there were no messages waiting for me. I kept checking social media even though I promised myself I wouldn't. One night curiosity finally won. I searched Ethan's name online. There were photos from another family barbecue only 2 weeks after I left. Everyone smiled beside the swimming pool like nothing had happened. Chloe posted a caption saying, "Family is everything." I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I quietly deleted every social media account I had. That was the moment I truly disappeared. A month later, I found work at a bookstore called Blackwood Books near the center of town. The owner was a woman named Margaret Hale. She was in her late 60s, wore bright scarves every day, and always smelled faintly like cinnamon tea. Margaret studied me carefully during my interview. "You've got sad eyes," she said bluntly. I didn't know how to answer that. Then she smiled gently and added, "That usually means someone survived something." For some reason, those words nearly made me cry. Margaret hired me that same afternoon for £14 an hour. The bookstore was small but beautiful, with dark wooden shelves stacked all the way to the ceiling. A little bell rang every time customers entered, and soft jazz music played quietly in the background all day. Working there slowly saved me. Books gave me something safe to focus on. Stories reminded me that people could rebuild themselves after heartbreak. Every morning I organized shelves while sunlight poured through the front windows. Some customers stayed for hours talking about novels and poetry while rain tapped softly against the glass outside. Nobody there cared who I used to be. To them, I was simply Ava, the quiet woman who recommended good books and always watered the plants near the front door. Months passed slowly, but the pain inside me began to change shape. It no longer felt sharp. Instead, it became something distant, like an old scar that only hurt during storms. Then winter arrived. The ocean outside Brighton Cove turned grey and restless, and cold wind rattled the windows of my little cottage at night. I bought thick blankets and learned how to make soup from scratch because money still made me nervous. Even though I still had savings left, I feared depending on anyone ever again. One snowy evening, Margaret invited me to dinner at her house. She lived alone in a charming little home filled with old paintings and books stacked in every corner. While we ate roasted chicken and potatoes, she suddenly looked at me and asked, "Does anyone from your old life ever call?" I paused before answering. No. Margaret looked strangely angry at that. "Then they were fools," she said simply. I stared down at my plate because nobody had defended me like that in years. As time passed, Brighton Cove started feeling less like a hiding place and more like home. I learned the names of local shop owners. I started drinking coffee every morning at a cafe near the harbor where the owner, Daniel, always saved my favorite seat near the window. I planted flowers in my garden during spring and painted the walls of my cottage pale blue. Little by little, I became someone new. Then, almost exactly 2 years after I disappeared, everything changed again. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Margaret walked into the bookstore carrying a newspaper under her arm. Her expression looked nervous, which immediately made my stomach tighten. Without saying a word, she placed the newspaper on the counter in front of me. There, on the front page, was a photo of Ethan. Older, tired, broken. The headline talked about financial disaster, failed investments, and millions of dollars lost. Robert Carter's business had collapsed after risky deals destroyed the family company. Their giant house in America had already been sold to pay debts. Reporters described the Carter family as once wealthy, now struggling. I stared at the article while rain hammered against the bookstore windows. Margaret touched my arm carefully. "Darling," she asked softly, "are you all right?" I looked at Ethan's picture one last time before folding the newspaper closed. And to my own surprise, I smiled. Not because I was happy they suffered, but because for the first time in years, their lives no longer controlled my emotions. "I think," I said quietly, "I finally stopped disappearing." After reading the newspaper article about Ethan and his family, I expected to feel something dramatic. Anger, satisfaction, revenge, maybe even sadness. But none of those emotions came. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like I was looking at strangers instead of people who once controlled my entire life. For 2 years I had imagined what would happen if Ethan ever tried to contact me again. In my mind, I pictured long emotional conversations or angry arguments filled with blame. But now that the moment felt possible, I realized I no longer needed answers from him.
time had already answered everything.
Outside the bookstore, rain poured heavily onto the empty streets of Brighton Cove. The windows fogged from the warmth inside while soft jazz music played through the speakers near the register. Margaret quietly returned to organizing bookshelves, pretending not to watch me too closely.
I folded the newspaper and slid it beneath the counter.
"Do you want to go home early?"
Margaret asked gently. I shook my head. No, I'm all right.
And surprisingly, I meant it. That evening I walked home through the rain carrying a bag of groceries against my chest. The cold wind tangled my hair while ocean waves crashed loudly against the shore nearby. Normally I loved the peaceful sound, but that night something felt unsettled inside me. Maybe it was seeing Ethan's face again after so long. Maybe some part of me knew the past wasn't finished yet. When I reached my cottage, I made tea and changed into warm clothes before curling up on the sofa with a book. The house smelled faintly like lavender from the dried flowers hanging near the kitchen window. Rain tapped softly against the glass while thunder rolled far out over the ocean. Then my phone rang. I froze immediately. Almost nobody had my number. The screen showed an international number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something deep inside me already knew who it was. Slowly, I answered. Hello. There was silence at first. Then a familiar voice spoke quietly. Ava. My chest tightened instantly. It was Ethan. I hadn't heard his voice in 2 years, but I recognized it immediately. It sounded different now, weaker somehow. Less confident. Gone was the easy arrogance he always carried around his family. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan let out a shaky breath. "I've been trying to find you for months." I stared at the rain sliding down the cottage windows. "That sounds difficult," I answered calmly. Another silence followed. Then he whispered, "You really disappeared." The strange thing was that his voice almost sounded hurt by it. I leaned back slowly against the sofa cushions. "You told me nobody would notice," I reminded him quietly. Ethan inhaled sharply like the words physically hurt him. "Ava, I know I was wrong." For years I had dreamed about hearing him say that. I imagined it would heal something inside me. But now the apology felt empty, arriving far too late to matter. "I read the article," I said. He laughed bitterly under his breath. "Yeah, I figured you probably did." The storm outside grew louder while Ethan began explaining everything. Robert lost millions of dollars investing in risky companies. Linda blamed everyone else instead of accepting reality. Their beautiful house in America was gone. Chloe had apparently borrowed money from family members before disappearing herself after the business collapsed. "It's like everything started falling apart after you left," Ethan admitted quietly. I closed my eyes for a moment. Back then they treated me like I was invisible. Now suddenly they spoke as if I had been holding their entire world together. "That's not my responsibility," I said softly. "I know." But his voice sounded desperate. I needed to hear your voice again." The honesty in his words surprised me. Years ago, Ethan rarely admitted vulnerability. He cared too much about appearing successful and in control. Even during our marriage, he avoided serious conversations whenever possible. Problems were easier for him to ignore than fix. But now he sounded exhausted. Broken, even. "Ava," he said carefully, "I miss you." Those 3 words once would have shattered me completely. But sitting there in my small cottage beside the ocean, they felt strangely distant. Like hearing lyrics from an old song I no longer connected with. I looked around my living room. The shelves I built myself. The books stacked beside the fireplace. The little blue blanket folded over the armchair. Every peaceful thing surrounding me existed because I finally chose myself instead of begging others to value me. "I spent years trying to make your family love me," I said quietly. "And you stood there every single time they hurt me." Ethan didn't argue. "That barbecue," I continued. "Do you know what hurt the most?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. "What?" "You laughed too." The silence afterward felt heavy. Then I heard him crying quietly on the other end of the phone. It shocked me because Ethan almost never cried. During our marriage, he once sat expressionless through his grandfather's funeral while everyone else broke down around him. But now his breathing sounded uneven. "I was stupid," he admitted. "I thought if I laughed with them, it would keep things easy." And did it? No. I stared at the dark ocean outside my window. "I loved you, Ethan." "I know." "No," I said firmly. "I don't think you ever understood how much." Another painful silence followed. Finally he spoke again. "Can we meet? Please?" I could come to Europe. For a brief moment, part of me remembered the man I married. The version of Ethan before disappointment hardened everything between us. I remembered road trips, late-night conversations, and the way he used to kiss my forehead when he thought I was asleep.
But memories alone cannot rebuild trust. Some damage changes people permanently. No, I answered gently. Ethan sounded crushed. Ava.
I didn't leave to punish you, I said softly. I left because staying was destroying me.
He said nothing.
I learned how to survive without all of you, I continued.
And honestly, I like the woman I became. The rain outside finally began slowing. Ethan cleared his throat quietly.
I don't think I ever really saw how unhappy you were. That's because nobody was looking.
My words weren't cruel. Just true. After a long pause, Ethan asked one final question.
Did you ever love someone else?
I almost smiled sadly. No, I answered.
I finally learned how to love myself.
He cried harder after hearing that.
And strangely, I didn't feel powerful listening to it. I just felt free. Eventually, the conversation ended quietly.
No screaming. No dramatic goodbye.
Just silence between two people who once shared a life but no longer belonged in each other's future. After hanging up, I placed the phone on the table and sat still for a long time. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the dark ocean beyond Brighton Cove. For 2 years, I thought disappearing made me weak.
But now I understood the truth.
Leaving had been the bravest thing I ever did. The ones who were forgotten life became quieter after Ethan's phone call.
Not sad quiet. Peaceful quiet.
The kind of silence that no longer felt empty because I had finally filled it with things that belonged to me. My mornings started with coffee beside the kitchen window while sunlight slowly touched the ocean outside Brighton Cove. I spent afternoons inside the bookstore helping customers find novels, listening to soft music, and laughing with Margaret whenever she complained dramatically about modern romance books. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. A few months after Ethan called, Margaret officially retired and sold Blackwood Books to me for £75,000. I nearly refused because the price felt too generous for a bookstore that meant so much to her, but Margaret only waved her hand dismissively. You already gave this place a soul, she told me. Now it deserves your name on the door. So I renamed it *Second Chapter Books. The sign outside was painted dark blue with gold letters curling across the wood. Every morning when I unlocked the front door, I still felt proud seeing my own future built with my own hands. Customers from all over town visited regularly. Children sat in the reading corner near the fireplace while tourists wandered through shelves filled with old novels and poetry collections.
People knew me there.
Not as Ethan's wife. Not as the invisible girl at family barbecues. Just Ava. And somehow, that simple thing meant everything.
Spring arrived gently in Brighton Cove.
Flowers bloomed along the sidewalks, and warm ocean air drifted through the bookstore windows each afternoon. Business was good enough that I even hired a university student named Lily to help during busy weekends. She talked too much, drank too much coffee, and somehow made the bookstore feel even warmer. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was organizing new arrivals behind the counter when the bell above the front door rang softly. "Welcome to Second Chapter Books," I said automatically without looking up.
No answer came.
Something about the silence made me glance toward the entrance. And instantly, my stomach tightened. Standing near the door was Chloe Carter. For a second I barely recognized her. The confident woman from those summer barbecues was gone. Her expensive clothes looked wrinkled, dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and her posture carried exhaustion instead of arrogance. Even her hair seemed duller than I remembered. She looked around the bookstore slowly before her eyes finally landed on me. "Ava," she said quietly. I straightened carefully behind the counter. "Chloe." The tension between us filled the room immediately. Even Lily sensed something strange because she quickly disappeared upstairs pretending to organize inventory. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Chloe stood awkwardly near the entrance like she wasn't sure she deserved to come farther inside. Finally, she spoke again. "This place is beautiful." "Thank you." Another silence followed. 2 years ago, I would have been nervous standing in front of her. Back then Chloe always knew exactly how to make me feel small. She was the kind of person who smiled while insulting you and somehow convinced everyone else it was harmless. But now, she looked smaller than me. Not physically. Emotionally. "I was nearby for work," she explained nervously. "Someone told me about this bookstore. I didn't realize it was yours until I saw the sign outside." I nodded politely but said nothing. Chloe looked down at her hands before finally taking a slow breath. I owe you an apology.
The words clearly hurt her pride, but I waited quietly.
That barbecue, she continued softly. What I said was cruel. Yes, I answered honestly. It was. Her eyes filled with guilt almost immediately. At the time, I thought I was being funny. Everyone laughed, so I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal.
I remembered that night perfectly. The music, the laughter,
Ethan smiling beside his cousins while humiliation burned through my chest. It mattered to me, I said calmly.
Chloe nodded slowly.
I know that now.
For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The bookstore felt strangely still around us.
Then Chloe surprised me by asking, "Did you really leave that same night because of what I said?"
I thought carefully before answering.
Not because of one joke, I said softly. Because it made me realize nobody there cared how much I was hurting.
Her face fell instantly.
Rain continued sliding down the windows while customers passed outside holding umbrellas along the street. Inside the bookstore, the smell of coffee and old pages filled the air warmly between us.
Chloe glanced around the room again.
You built all of this by yourself? Yes. She laughed sadly under her breath. That doesn't surprise me anymore.
I crossed my arms gently.
What do you mean?
Chloe hesitated before answering.
After you left, everything changed.
I stayed silent.
At first everyone thought you'd come back after a few days, she admitted.
Then weeks passed.
Then months.
Ethan became miserable. Mom kept pretending nothing was wrong.
Dad buried himself in work.
She paused heavily. And honestly,
the family started falling apart.
I listened quietly while she spoke.
The truth is, you held everything together more than any of us realized. The irony almost made me smile. Back then they treated me like I was invisible.
Now suddenly I was important. But it no longer mattered.
Chloe walked slowly between the bookshelves while speaking softly.
Ethan still talks about you. I looked down at the counter.
He called me months ago.
She stopped walking immediately.
You answered. Yes.
And?
There's nothing left to fix. Chloe nodded sadly like she already knew that answer. For a few moments she browsed random books silently before finally returning to the counter. Her eyes looked softer now, less guarded. You know what the worst part is? She asked quietly.
I raised an eyebrow.
We all thought money and appearances made us important.
She laughed bitterly.
Turns out we were just loud people standing inside a big expensive house pretending to love each other.
Her honesty surprised me.
Then she added softly, you were the only real thing any of us had. The words hung heavily between us.
Years ago hearing that might have healed something inside me. But now it simply felt like a truth arriving too late.
Chloe reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It's Ethan's new number, she said carefully. In case you ever change your mind. I looked at the paper for a second before gently pushing it back toward her. I won't. For the first time, Chloe didn't argue.
Instead, she nodded with quiet understanding.
I think he knows that too. The bell above the bookstore door rang softly as she prepared to leave. Before stepping outside into the rain, she paused near the entrance and looked back at me one final time.
You know something funny, she said sadly.
What? The woman we all thought nobody would notice ended up being impossible to forget.
Then she walked away.
I stood there quietly for a long time after she disappeared down the street. Rain continued falling outside while soft music played through the bookstore speakers. And for the first time, I truly understood something important.
I never disappeared at all.
I simply stopped existing in places that never deserved me.